Hello, this is Roger Capello, bringing you the action in episode 27 of My Week at the Club from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. And this week I played a game against Arthur Barlas, as those of you who know Arthur can see in the upper right there. In the middle panel, there's a shot taken this week by the Mars Reconnaissance Explorer of the Earth and Moon. And I thought it was kind of cool. It's not a very beautiful shot, but it's neat to think that we can actually have a spacecraft that's 100 million miles away right now and get a picture of our own little system here. And it brings up the question of what the Earth and Moon look like from Mars. Now, of course, this is taken by the satellite that has a telescope built into it. So you normally wouldn't be able to see this sort of view with your naked eye. You'd have to have a small telescope on the surface of Mars to see something like this. But basically, the closest that Mars ever gets to the Earth is about 35 million miles. And the Moon is got a 250,000-mile diameter orbit, roughly. So that means it's about 140 times as far away from the Moon. So the angle between the Earth and the Moon at most is about 140th of a radian, and that's about a third of a degree. Now the Moon is a half a degree in diameter, full Moon as seen from the Earth. So the separation, looking from Mars, the separation of the Earth and Moon is a little less, the maximum separation is a little less than the size of the full Moon, or of the Sun for that matter, as seen from the Earth. And that's when it's at its closest. For this particular picture, it was at a distance of about 100 million miles. So it's about 3 times smaller than that. So it's only maybe, let's see, so a third of a degree, a ninth of a degree. So that's about 20% of the Moon's diameter. So it's quite close to the Moon. So the Moon would look quite close to the Earth. You'd see two little dots of light, and you'd be able to resolve them, though. They wouldn't blend into a single blurry dot, except when the Moon and the Earth happen to be just about aligned. In fact, for this picture, the Moon and the Earth were just about aligned. It doesn't look like it from the picture, but actually the Moon is just about directly behind the Earth, because the Moon's distance is about 30 Earth diameters, and you can see from this picture it's only about 5 or 6. Anyhow, one other thing I wanted to mention was that as far as brightness goes, the Earth as seen from Mars is going to be a little less bright than Venus, because we don't reflect as much sunlight as the clouds on Venus do. That's reflected in our lower albedo, and also, of course, we're further away from the sun. So it would be more like Jupiter or so in terms of brightness. Jupiter is seen from the Earth. It's kind of confusing when you're using different viewpoints. And the Moon would be, of course, dimmer still, because it's got a quarter of the diameter of the Earth, so it's 16 times less area, and it's something like 4 times darker in terms of its albedo. It's quite a dark surface, whereas the Earth is, much of it is clouds, although not all of it, as you can see in the picture. So the Moon would look like, Saturn or something like that, as seen from the Earth. Kind of a bright, if we're a star, it's brighter than most of the stars, but still less bright than the Earth would look. So you'd see that little twin star up in the sky. Okay, on to the chess. So as you can see from the description here, Arthur opened with e4 and I played e5 against him. I'm not sure why that c5 is there. I was maybe thinking about talking about something in the Sicilian, but I played e5. Double king pawn game. We both developed our knights in the usual way, and he went into a Roy Lopez or Spanish opening. And I kicked the bishop. Of course, the most popular move these days at the highest levels is the Berlin defense, knight to f6, but I don't claim to know the intricacies of the Berlin. And instead, relieved a little bit of the pressure of the bishop so that I could drive it away at some point with a timely b5 if necessary. He backed the bishop up to a4, and then I went ahead and played my pawn to d6. This is called the modern Steinitz defense. If the bishop isn't chased away with the a pawn, and you instead immediately play d6. So back in this position, if you immediately play d6, that's the Steinitz defense. And so what I often play in this situation is the modern Steinitz, which puts in that little extra move due to Paul Morphy of a6, driving the bishop away, or sometimes exchanging the bishop for the knight if white wants to do that. But relieving the pressure a little bit on that knight, and then play d6. So black in a Steinitz, modern Steinitz, black gets a cramped game, but it's solid, it's durable, and I've had pretty good success as far as my scores with it. So I decided to go ahead and play that in this game. Arthur played h3, which I've never faced before. It's an unusual move, and I looked it up in the database. As you can see in the text here, there are games in the database of master play, almost 30 games, but it's out of 5,000. So that's less than 1% of the time that this move is played. So it's not too surprising that I've never encountered it before. With masters, the black-white scoring ratio is about 50-50. So it's, white gets a playable game, but nothing more than that. It's not much of an advantage to speak of, at least with the statistics available. Okay, I played g6. As I said in my notes there, it's not a very common move in this position, although it's certainly a reasonable move. And the idea is that the dark squared bishop is going to have a hard time finding a lot of life along the f8 to a3 diagonal because of this pawn that I have on d6. So instead, the bishop fianchettos on g7. Oop, get back. You don't want to see that much of the game. Well, you do, but maybe later. Okay, so after g6, Arthur went ahead and played c3, preparing to support his pawn advance in the center to d4. I went ahead and fianchettoed, and he castled. Now, interestingly enough, when you look in the database, now there are 50 games in this position. So there are more games, but they were arrived at by a different move order than how Arthur and I are getting here. In this position, though, the move that I played, knight to e7, has only been played 4 times out of those 50. And the rest of the times, knight to, in this position, either knight to f6 or bishop to d7. Knight to f6 or bishop to d7, which are both thematic moves in modern Steinitz, are what's normally played. But I played my knight instead to e7. The idea being, of course, that if white decides to capture on c6, I can keep my pawns from being, my pawn structure intact, from being ruined. He played rook to e1. That supports his e-pawn, so that if he plays d4, then that e-pawn is adequately supported, even though right now I don't have it under fire. I went ahead at this point and castled to get my king out of Dodge City there on the e-file, and with his rook exerting distant pressure on it. And he went ahead and played d4. And now I have to seriously, I have to make sure that I keep my e-pawn adequately defended. It's in pretty good shape right now because I have the bishop, the knight, and the pawn all pointed here at e4, or e5 rather. And he has just a pawn and a knight currently attacking it. Now, he can trade off my knight, but I can take back with my other knight, so that doesn't really affect anything. So for now, that e-pawn is adequately defended. But I have to go on and keep developing. So what I did here was to play bishop to d7. It's a move. It's a reasonable square that black often goes to neutralize the bishop on that diagonal. And usually white will retreat, either immediately or sometime in the near future to either b3 or c2 to find a new diagonal to cause some mischief on. So let's roll this down a bit here. Arthur continued with bishop to e3. So that supports his center. It's still a move that is being played by strong players in the database. And at this point, I think there were a dozen or so games up to this point. and then 3 or 4 after bishop d3. And I played king to h8. And there's only one game after bishop d3. And in that game, after the bishop d3 move, black simply played queen to e8, which was a move that was in my mind here because that exerts pressure on this bishop and also escapes a possible pin along this diagonal, like dark square diagonal here if the bishop comes out to g5. Instead, I wanted to play f5, and I didn't want to expose myself to check, and so that's why I played king h8 at this point. Now, what I was worried about actually is not what the computer would have recommended. So what I thought would happen if I played f5 at this point was that he might play bishop to b3 check. My king would have to go to the corner, and then he might play knight to g5, putting pressure on my f7 square, and I would have to do something like coming over here with my queen in order to keep him from forking my king and queen and costing me the exchange because I'd have to take with the rook. That's not actually what the computer would do. If the computer, back in this position, let's go back a little bit. After f5, let's see, the computer, I know it wanted to do something else. That's right, it wanted to exchange pawns in the center and then play the bishop out to g5 to pin this knight. But anyhow, this weakness remains. White even, if he wants at some point, I have to consider the possibility, if I open up this light square diagonal, of him playing the queen out to b3 check and coming after this b pawn. Might not be a good idea right at the moment, but it's certainly something I would have to watch out for. In any event, I didn't want to worry about those extra possibilities for white, and so I played king to h8. And Arthur responded with playing his other knight to d2. Then I played my f5 move. Now, I realized when I made this move that it was provocative and was certainly exposing me to the possibility of losing a pawn in the center. But I sort of felt that White's been playing a fairly slow maneuvering game, and the only real advantage, let's see, go back one move here, the only real advantage that White has at this point is a bit more influence in the center with these the D and E pawns against my two pawns, which are not quite as aggressively posted. My D6 pawn is just on the third rank. And that's really the advantage that he has. I mean, he also has the rook on the E file, I guess, is the one other possibility. But it seemed to me like we were, fairly balanced here, and that it's not wouldn't be too silly for black to push for an initiative at this point in time. So I went ahead and played f5. And there's nothing horrible about that, according to the computer. Computer wanted to exchange the D pawn for the E pawn. Arthur played e takes f5. And my original plan was to, I didn't expect him to take. And the reason I didn't expect him to take was that it seemed like, that would just invite my pieces to the action. So I was thinking that something like knight takes on f5 would be a sensible thing to do here. But if I did that, I might have seen something like this happen. The bishop could come out and attack my queen. My queen would have to move. He could attack my knight. My knight has no choice but to move somewhere. Perhaps falling back to the vacated e7 square. White could trade off the bishops, okay, and then that white knight can now use that nice e4 square that gets vacated. So a real problem back in this position, back one more, a real problem if I take back with a piece is that he has freed up this e4 square for his knight to use. And I didn't want that to happen. And it would be could happen regardless of how I took back, if I took back with the piece. So I took back with the g pawn instead. So now I'm controlling this e4 square, admittedly loosening up my king's position somewhat, but also by the same token making the possibility of my rook coming to g8 at some point and attacking along the g file toward his king. So it makes his king less secure as well. So it's a double-edged move. It definitely sharpens up the game. And I was happy with my position at this point. He traded off pawns, d takes e, d takes e, and then played knight to g5. Now, actually in this position, I thought he would play bishop to g5, pinning my knight to the queen. I was more concerned about that move. The computer actually likes, in this position, bishop to c5 rather. And it still pins the knight, but it pins it to the rook. And it's just a more active diagonal, I think, for the bishop than this one that's over on the king side. He did not play that. He instead came up with the knight. And although that looks superficially good, it's not such a good move. And the reason is that I can simply respond with queen to e8, which I did do. And now I'm starting to actually develop a bit of initiative of my own over here. I should point out, let me go back one move here. Knight to g5, I have to be careful, because if I allow his queen to come out to h5, then that could get to be pretty scary for me. He has, he'd be threatening mate on h7, which I'd have to do something about. He could bring up his other knight to support that knight. He has this bishop that could come into play in the attack, and even the rook could come up and over and get into the attack. So there's some real possibilities for a kingside attack for white here. So I have to step a little carefully. And one of the real there were three nice things about queen to e8, I guess. But one of the real nice ones was that it keeps his queen from coming out to this h5 square, because my queen now controls that diagonal. Another thing it does is it allows my queen maybe to come out and aggressively play against his king with queen to g6 at some point, and then attacking along the g file. The other thing it does is threatens to move this knight on c6 with an exposed double attack on the bishop. And so I was looking into doing something like that at some point. I couldn't do it right now, but whenever there was a piece on either e2 or f3, I can do that sort of thing, because there's a Zwischenzug. If I play the knight even to a square where the pawn can take it, after the pawn, if the pawn were to take the knight, I can take the bishop and then take the pawn back. Or if he played bishop takes bishop, I could play knight takes something check, and he'd have to do something about that, and then I could take his bishop. So it ends up there's a little combination that I was sort of aiming toward, but it never actually came into the game. So I don't really have it here to show you. Okay, at this point, Arthur played bishop to c5, so he got that pin in that the computer was requesting a few moves back. And I was starting to worry a little bit about the pressure that he was getting. If his knight moves off of the d file, then he has the queen attacking d7, and this knight then, his bishop is indirectly attacking my bishop, so this knight is frozen in place. This knight is pinned. There are various possibilities coming along for attack. So at this point, I decided to drive his knight away and back to f3. And he surprised me. And I didn't see this move. I figured he didn't have, back here in this position, that he didn't have any squares to go to with his knight, that he had to go back, that his only possibility was to come back here to f3. But he actually had this Zug of capturing my knight, and all of a sudden, I don't really have any, on the surface of it, I don't have a nice way to recapture. I could recapture with a pawn, and that would wreck my pawn structure. I could recapture with the bishop, but that would allow his knight to come into this e6 square. Or I could take with the knight, but that would allow his bishop then to take my rook. And it was looking a little ugly no matter what I did for a couple of seconds. But then I breathed a sigh of relief because I realized that he can't come into e6 because of a little tactical reason. And so I just went ahead and took it with my bishop the way I wanted to, because now this bishop is very strong along this diagonal, attacking over by his king side. Arthur went ahead and made kind of the crucial mistake in the game here of knight to e6. And the problem with that is that I can simply play queen to g6, and now I'm threatening checkmate. And so, he has to do something about the checkmate, and this knight on e6 is going to hang. The problem, there's this. I guess this is something that shows up in a lot of games. I mean, some games, are small advantage after small advantage, and eventually it builds up, and you get a winning position, and that's it. But many games go along without too much happening, maybe a little bit of advantage going to one side or the other, and then some crucial mistake being made, and then that mistake more or less decides the game. And that's what happened here. So Arthur goes down a piece at this point. He struggles valiantly on and puts up a good fight, and I had some worries in playing the rest of the game. But basically the computer didn't have any worries. The computer for the rest of the game is totally happy with black's position. So he chose to play knight to f3 at this point to stop the checkmate. Sitting over the board, I sort of expected that he might play knight back to f4, defending the mate. And it's true, black can go ahead and take the pawn, or take the knight rather with the pawn, and renew the checkmate threat, so white doesn't really have time. It almost looks like he's saving his piece because of the attack on the knight, but he doesn't have time to save the piece because he has to do something about the attack on g2. But he could play knight to f3 like he did a move earlier. And yeah, I thought this was maybe a little better for him than what he chose to do. Although what he chose to do had some interesting tactics involved. And so why don't we look at that? So he played his other knight to f3, and then after I took his knight, he played his knight to the interesting square d4. Now, it turns out, with the help of this silicon creature in front of me, that this is not his best move, that he's actually better off going ahead and taking the e-pawn. And the reason for that is because I can't afford to take this pawn. If I play bishop takes knight, he just goes ahead and, I was worried about a pawn, f4 or something like that, attacking the pinned piece, but I have some counter chances because he has this loose bishop and so on. But instead, he could just simply play rook takes bishop. And I can't take back because of the pin. If I were to take back, he just simply plays bishop to d4, and now my queen is lost because of the pin, not quite along that diagonal, along this diagonal. So instead, he did not. He could have taken that pawn, and that would at least have taken an important center pawn back. Instead, he attacked my queen. My queen has to go somewhere. The best place for it to go, it turns out, is to play to d4, or d5 rather. Instead, I played queen to f6. The idea, if I play to d5, is that once again I'm threatening checkmate. Of course, he was forking with his knight. He was forking my knight and my queen and bishop, and he can just simply take the bishop now to stop the mate threat. But the point here now is that I can take, instead of recapturing a knight, I can take his bishop that was sitting loose, and then when he has nothing better really than to take my knight, and then I go ahead and recapture the queen, and black has a lovely position here, a whole piece up. Right? So instead, though, I play queen to f6, and now his best move is to go ahead and take this bishop, and I can't take the loose bishop on c5 anymore. And it turns out that taking this knight with anything other than the pawn is bad. If I take it with this knight, then he takes my rook. If I take it with the queen, then he wins my knight. So either of those options is not good, and I would have nothing better than to take with the pawn. And he at least has gotten some concessions here, some compensation in the form of the weak c-pawns on my king side. So that probably would have been best for him. Instead, at this point, he just retreated to f3. Wait a second, I went queen to f6. There he retreats to f3. Okay. So let's scroll down a bit here. After he did that, I played my rook to d8 to activate it, to put it on an open file. One problem, though, of course, is that it causes his queen to go maybe to a better square, where he's now putting even more pressure on my e-pawn. And I played, after queen to e2, I put my rook on e8 to indirectly help to defend along the e file. He can, in fact, go ahead and win a pawn here. But, if I were, I looked for quite a while at this point, I think for 10 of my 30 minutes or so, at rook to d5, defending the pawn and driving his bishop away. And it's true that after bishop here, then I have a move to try to do something. But this rook seemed like it was misplaced on d5. I didn't like that move too well. It's blocking the diagonal for my bishop, and it can be attacked by the c-pawn. It just didn't seem like my pieces were coordinating very well, which is why I chose to make this rook to e8 move, which at least gets my, it unpins this knight that's on d7. So it's no longer pinned by the bishop, and also is threatening to become active, very active along the e file. That's why I finally chose that move. I think it's a reasonable choice. He went ahead and took the pawn, and I actually have a nice rejoinder, which I don't think I saw until after he went ahead and took the pawn. I discovered that I could play knight to g6. It's a good move. As I say in my notes there, it turns out that knight to d5 is even better in that position, but you'd have to be a computer to see it. I'll just run through this line very fast. After knight to d5, I was worried about bishop to d4. I didn't like that move too well, but I can attack his queen. His queen moves. Okay, then I can take the g-pawn, at least a computer would. Now, if there's a discovered attack by the knight moving, my queen can, at least if it's a check, my queen can recapture. But if he plays queen to g3, then I can go ahead and take the rook on e1. Notice that I should back up here, that this is a fork. So, if he's not going to, he has to do something about moving the queen. And then when the queen moves, the rook gets captured. He retakes the rook. I could play queen to g5, forcing the queens off, although this looks like a very bad mistake because of knight to f7 check. But in reality, it isn't, because white can simply move his king. And now, for example, if white were to play knight takes queen immediately, or after trading off a pair of rooks, then I can come down with a check. King has to move, and there's a checkmate. I didn't see that on the board. So I I did in this position see that if I played knight to d5, that he might play bishop d4, and that was enough to convince me it wasn't a good move. And this knight g6 is a good move. It attacks that knight a fourth time. It's not defended enough, and if he plays knight takes knight, like he does, I can simply take it back with my queen. So there's no bad discovered check or anything. And, oh, the nice thing now is after I take back with the queen, is his queen now is under attack, and he's also in threat of checkmate here. I'm threatening checkmate. So his box move is to play the queen back to f1, which is a very passive post. And at this point, black is clearly winning. It's I forget what the computer thinks the advantage is. About a 4-pawn advantage. Note that the computer at this point is asking me to trade off rooks and then play rook to d2. And I considered that line. I'll just very briefly show it. If I take, he can't take back with the queen because the queen is tethered to the defense of this g2 square. There's a checkmate threatened on g2, so he can't, if I took back with the queen, it would be a deflection move, and I would checkmate on g2. So he, in fact, has to take back with the rook. Then I could have played rook to d2, which is what I looked at, but I didn't make the move because I didn't like the idea then of him playing rook to e7, getting his rook active. But in reality, if I'd gone one move further, I would have realized I could just play rook d1 at that point. And that's very bad for him. His queen can't leave f1. I'm threatening to take the queen. He could block with the rook, like so, but then I could play rook takes rook. And he can't afford to take it back because, again, there's a checkmate with my queen on g2. So that would have been very bad for him. So in this position here, I really should have traded off rooks and played rook to d2 like was my initial idea. Instead, after I looked at it for quite a while, I decided to play bishop to f6, which is not a bad move. It anchors my rook on d8, makes that nice and solid, exerts more control over this e7 square. Oops, take that back. This e7 square, and also clears the g file for my rook to come over and threaten checkmate along with my queen. So it's a multi-purpose move. I liked it reasonably well. Arthur went ahead and traded a pair of rooks off and then developed his rook to d1, which I think is a reasonable defense. Then when I play rook to g8, he has to do something about the mate threat. And there are a couple of ways of meeting it, but none of them are really very good. He went ahead and pushed the g-pawn, but now that really further weakens his king side, and I can attack that weakened g-pawn with my f-pawn, and it's pinned. He can't take back, so instead he pushes forward. And here at this point there was a good move which I missed that the computer clued. I didn't even think about it during the game. It's not like I thought about it and discarded it, but it's to play queen h5, a very strong move. Of course, the queen can't be taken because of the pin along the g file. And if you played bishop back to d4, threatening to take my loose bishop with check, now I probably would have played bishop takes bishop just to eliminate that threat. But even stronger is rook takes pawn check. And that's because after the quote-unquote obvious move of taking the rook, that loses immediately because a queen takes pawn check, and now he can't, this bishop over here governs the g2 square, so he can't block with his queen, and so his only move is to come to h2. I can check him from h4. He has to, again, he can't afford to block, actually can afford to block with a queen. For some reason, this was not good. Okay, actually, I'm Okay, well, interest of time, I could figure this out, but in interest of time, let's see why it was that it wasn't good. It's to, okay, to go ahead and take the bishop. And now, after, okay, it has the computer playing rook to d3. If we're to take the bishop back, the, huh, says, ah, that's what it is. I can simply play queen back to h5 check, and if he blocks with the queen, if he doesn't block with the queen, then I'm going to mate him on h1. And if he plays king to g1, I can play queen h1. If he blocks, so get back here. If he blocks with the queen, then this rook is hanging over here, and that's why he would have had to have played rook to d3. So instead, after rook takes pawn, after in this move position, after rook takes check, and the king goes to h2. I mean, sorry, after rook takes check, the king would have to go to h2 because he can't afford to take back with the pawn and open up that file. And then after that move, black can simply come in and check with the rook. And the problem is that if queen takes a rook and the bishop takes back and the king takes the bishop, well, he wouldn't do that. He'd put in the sufficient zug, bishop takes bishop check, the king would move, then he would take the bishop. But at the tail end of all this, this rook here on d1 is hanging, and we'd simply take it. Now it's queen against a bishop. So a long line that only a computer would, I think we could all love it, but only a computer would find. That said, I played queen to e4, and this allowed him the option of playing f3 to block, which I think would have been a better move. Instead, he played king to h2. I jumped at the chance to then push my f-pawn to keep his f-pawn from moving, and then that cramps the defense. He won't be able to defend with a rook, for example, along the second rank. And he came over and attacked my queen. I came and checked. He played back. I played up to open up the remaining files here. And he attacked my queen. I moved it back to the third rank. He attacked it again with his rook. And then I came over to the light square diagonal to support the attack on the g4 pawn. I should, as I pointed out in my notes here, I had about 9 minutes at this point. Arthur had 4 minutes. So he had picked up the pace of play. And you may notice I'm picking up my pace of analysis too, because this is running a bit long. But you know, black has a quite a clear advantage of a whole piece, and plus an attack going on. And it's just a question of how it's going to happen. It's the writing's on the wall. So he played rook to e1. I went ahead and took the g pawn, and he can't really afford to take back and open up the h file for a check. Instead, he came to attack my bishop. I played queen f5, and then he took the pawn back. And then I saw a little mating sequence here with queen h7 check. And Arthur played king to g1 because to block with the queen is just to give it away. So he played king to g1. And I very rapidly, both of these moves I played quite rapidly with rook to g4. And I thought it was mate. I reached out my hand, and Arthur shook hands with me, and we stopped the clock and called that the end of the game. And it wasn't until I got home I realized that, gee, I kind of swindled him, at least from playing 2 more moves in this position. It's very definitely a forced mate, but it's not actually checkmate because he has the possibility of interposing the queen. So sorry, Arthur. I didn't mean to coerce you into resigning at that point, and you could have claimed that I was illegally stopping the clock and gotten some more time on your clock. But anyhow, you could have blocked with the queen. I would take it with the rook, check. The king has to move over, and then we have mate on h1. So, you know, it was hopeless at this point. and maybe Arthur saw it and just figured that it didn't really matter playing out the last two moves. But I overlooked it in my haste. For some reason, I was trying to play fast in Arthur's time pressure, which is never a good idea. And I just wanted to make a nice snappy checkmate. Mea culpa. And instead, I made a little error of form there. Anyhow, it was a fun game. I enjoyed it. It was a it was you know it was kind of a typical Roy Lopez. For a while, then it started to look a bit like about in this position, it started to look like a King's Indian. But except that the central pawn structure is not quite the same. There's no pawn on c4 in particular, and so the queenside pawn structure is a little different. But the kingside pawn structure looks like a King's Indian, and it was really just this one error here of knight into e6, allowing my mating or my forced threatened mate sequence to win his knight. That was turned the tide in the game. So next round is round 3. I'll be playing on the second board because there was upset on the very first board. And I think I'm scheduled to play Gary Broussard. So we'll see how that goes. I should have mentioned that Arthur and I had played 3 times before this game. And every single game I had white and Arthur had black. And so I had won those games, but preparing for this game wouldn't do any good because I didn't know what line he and I might go down. So I really just prepared for my possibility with Alex Venezia, which never took place. So thanks for listening. I will be back with more action a week from now and a little more astronomy. And until then, this is Roger Capello from the Wachusett Chess Club. Bye-bye.